your own dishes. That's why we don't throw out on plastic plates, paper plates, because we'd be here all night doing dishes. God knows our historical society, we do not have a dishwasher. That would be inappropriate, wouldn't it? We want to thank you all here for being tonight on this really very special occasion. You know, we kid around, we sang happy birthday, which is kind of hokey, but really, think of it, 100 years. That's really pretty neat. That the women and men in 1918 had the foresight to see this building, which was really a crummy building. It had fallen into disuse and disrepair, and it was just an eyesore in the town. And actually, there were people that were doing a little happy dance that they got to tear this building down because it had been an eyesore for so long. And some of the women in town, some of the families in town, saw it for what it was and realized it had to be saved, which was really a radical thought in 1918. I'm a child of the 50s. It was a radical thought in the 50s. And those 50s parents, they just wanted to get rid of all that old stuff and get new stuff. Anything you could come with Formica was better than that old stuff you had. I mean, it was a whole different mindset. And you have to give those families tremendous credit. And so they banded together, which was not a popular thing, because again, that town wanted it gone. Banded together to decide how they could go about saving it, and they were able to incorporate the Historical Society. You've all heard me do the tour. The thing that fascinates me is from the day they decided the building was worth saving until the day they incorporated the Raleigh Historical Society. 6 weeks. We debate longer than 6 weeks to decide what dessert to serve. God's honest truth. And to cut a bush, that's a year and a half worth of negotiation. I mean, it's just amazing to me that they made that kind of progress, that they were that forward thinking. And so we have everyone to thank for this 100th anniversary. All those people that started in 1918, and people more than I could ever count, that have worked for the Historical Society. As hard as those people in 1918, as hard as we're working now, for all those ensuing years between. We wouldn't be here. When I talk about the building being decrepit, part of that is what saved us, in that it hadn't been all updated because it was decrepit. You know what I'm saying? So it wasn't even a 1918 modern house. They did have some retro having to do to it, but it wasn't as modern as it could have been. It really worked in our favor, or their favor. And we salute the scores of men and women who've worked towards preservation within the society for the past 100 years. We note that we did not invent the Rowley-Powley Tea Party. We didn't even invent the covered dish supper. These are things they did back in 1918, 1920, 21, 22. They ran the Rowley-Powley Tea House until 1929. And I wasn't there in 1929, gray hair notwithstanding, but from what I read, I think they ran it once a week. We did it twice this year, and we haven't recovered yet. But they did it once a week. That's just amazing. And as you've all seen, they served extravagant things like toast with orange marmalade and cottage cheese. And people came for that. What I would like to know is how much they charge for that. We have the menus, but we don't have the amounts. Really, because they were pretty practical. They knew enough not to print the amounts on there because it changed next year or next month. That makes sense, except now we don't know how much they charge. What do you think? What do you think toast with orange marmalade and cottage cheese went for?
That was simpler.
6 cents.
Yeah, they were. Is that 10 cents? Is that 50 cents? I'm sure it was more like 10 cents. I think that. Yeah. And there was a specialty. The specialty included the cottage cheese. The regular tea was just the marmalade. It's just fantastic. And if it was not for them and all the money they raised at all of these fundraisers, and we've read about the fundraisers, we wouldn't be standing here today. The whole thing would have gone belly up a long time. So just so you know that we do our share, we built this beautiful barn. Now most people, 2/3 of the people have already been in this barn many times. We understand that. But for some of the people that haven't been here, this is a 1775 barn that was being torn down in Dover, New Hampshire. And it was taken down like a Lincoln log project and delivered here in an 18-wheeler. And then we went to fundraising. So now we had to raise funds to dig the hole, and then we had to raise funds to pour the concrete, and then we had to raise funds. It went on for 10 years. but look at this barn that we have. Again, a lot of work. Some of the key people in that, Diane McMahon was in charge of the fundraising effort, raised lots of money in those years. Thank you, Diane, and your whole We have past President Ed Desjardins here. Raise your hand, Ed. Ed is a retired architect who drew the plans and oversee a lot of the project. And it was Chris Gershen's. He was on duty at this point too. Chris Gershen is a well-known artist, and he was our president at one point. But the time and effort people have put into this historical society is really mind-boggling.
A lot of the gentlemen that were here would come in on a weekend, and there would be, I can't forget the guy that with the
Aaron Sturgis.
Aaron Sturgis. And we would help Aaron, and we'd work for whatever, 6-8 hours during each day of the week.
A lot of marriages were in serious jeopardy over those years. It was a struggle. We felt, I didn't have anything to do with it, but they felt that maybe the people in 1775 knew how to raise a barn, but these men were not going to be going to any barn raisings. So they hired Aaron Sturgis, who did all the framing with one of those big, what's that truck called?
Yeah.
Crane,
yeah.
Big crane.
They marked each piece with where the joints were, and it went together like a puzzle. So
and if you look at
piece by piece, you'll see that all pins, wood pins.
It's a big Lincoln log set, and we're very proud of it. But we continue to work on projects. One of the things we just did, which we're kind of proud of, although it's kind of in reverse, is that many years ago the Society rescued a railroad crossing shed from Nelson Chenard's lawn. Nelson Chenard is on the corner of Main Street and Jellison Road. And Mr. Chenard, the Chenard family had sold the property, and the new people moving in wanted no part of this crummy old shed that was there. And they were going to, what did they say, strip it out and knock it down. And people from the Historical Society, I believe Bobby Cianfrocca was instrumental in that, and Bob Mary, probably Ed, you were involved with that as well, got it dragged up here, probably a mile, and it sat on Bobby Cianfrocca's, I think we were still working on the bow. We didn't even have a space for another building. And the men restored it, they, made it weather tight, they painted it, they made it all nice, and then we had meetings on how we were going to use crossing shed in the Raleigh Historical Society campus. Turns out 10 or 15 years went by and we never did anything with it. In spite of our best intentions, I think it was still that bond project that was hanging over our head. And so over this past year, we made a deal with Ipswich. And so the Mineral Street Ipswich crossing shed, which has been in Raleigh for 50 years, has gone back to Ipswich now, which I think is very appropriate. They're just thrilled with it. And they're going to make a little railroad museum. And I mean a little, the shed's this big, but they're going to make a little railroad museum in the back of the herd house. So that's only within the last 2 weeks that that's happened. But that's, again, we're kind of pleased that we were able to find an appropriate home for it, someone who had more interest in restoring. We restored it, but we never filled it. It just stayed as a shed. So, and also if you notice, we replaced the bulkhead. That bulkhead was pretty sad. No one should be standing on that bulkhead, but that's just brand new. You've all heard my theory. Everything we do makes it look like we haven't done anything, but the bulkhead's new, but you shouldn't notice it because we just painted it the same color. It's all good, but it's not going to fall in now. I also just want to mention a little advertising. Kathy Cousins and Janet Peabody took their time and effort and set up two exhibits at the library. Kathy Cousins set up something along the lines of 40 photographs that were taken in previous Raleigh Historical Society contests, photo contests, and it's called Essential Raleigh, and it's just fabulous. It's fabulous. It really is. If you have a chance, stop by the library. But go quickly, because it's a September exhibit. So it could be gone Monday. Go tomorrow. And Janet did the display case. Now, they have a display case, and she wanted to focus on some of the occupations in Raleigh. But when you think of it, it's a display case. We have a lot of big stuff, but this just won't fit in the display case. She was looking for little things. She walked around the building, little things that she could find to put in the display case. And she did a really nice job, and you should try to take an opportunity to go to the library, which is open from like 10 to 2 tomorrow. Joan Lyons in the room?
Yes.
10 to 2 tomorrow?
10 to 2.
10 to 2. So if you get a chance, go to the library. Thank you, Kathy and Janet. Just wonderful. You've seen all our programming. I'm taking up too much time because the speaker wants to speak. But know that the programming continues. We have the memoir class coming up. We have the appraisal night, Antiques Appraisal Night, middle of October. Vampire Sexy towards the end of October. And then we're going to have our Christmas Gala, again, first weekend in December. And something new as part of our 100th anniversary celebration, we're inviting the Delvina Theater back to do a Christmas Carol. Now, how many of you came to meet Julia Child by the Delvina Theater? Meet Julia Child, 2 women, and I mean, I stood and talked to the ladies when they first walked in. I'm like, yeah. She turned into Julia Child. Her voice turned into Julia Child. It was amazing. They were so good. The only reason the second woman was there was really to give Julia someone to talk to. You know what I'm saying? They needed the 2. So now they're going to do a Christmas Carol with 3 people. Have you seen the Christmas Carol? I don't understand how that's going to work, but I have enormous faith that they're going to make it work. So consider that. That, I believe, is Saturday the 15th of December, and it's at the library. So it's free of charge. We can't charge for anything at the library. But we certainly made new friends along the way. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our tenant, Jacob. But I don't know if he's here. Is Jacob in the room? No. He was baking. I talked to him, half an hour ago. So the cookies must not be ready. But we do have a new tenant, Jacob Bennett. He's just recently graduated from Gordon College, and he's a brand new band director at St. John's Prep Junior High. So he's thrilled with the apartment. And I did point out Ed Desjardins, and we also have past president Bill Cousins is here. Again, it's an enormous amount of work. A lot of people have put in a lot of time, and they all deserve credit for us being able to make our 100th anniversary. That being said, the next order, and the last order of business is we have a report of the nominating committee. For good, bad, or evil, the offices have decided to stay. That may be bad in that we don't have a lot of motion of different ideas, but it's good because we don't have empty spaces. Did I introduce myself? My name is Susan Hazen. I'm the president. So I said I'd do it again. Nothing bad has happened to me yet, so we're good. Vice President Bob Mary said he'd stay on. Treasurer Sam Strife said he'd stay on. Assistant Treasurer Elizabeth Hicken. How long have you been working as a treasurer, Elizabeth?
How many years? Since 1981 or 2.
This is the kind of dedication we have. 1981 or 2. Amazing. The recording secretary right now is a vacancy, and corresponding secretary is Joan Lyons. And Joan agreed, did you agree to continue on for another year? The board of directors was Charlie Hazen, Sue Elwell's here, who's probably doing dishes, and Stephanie Cobb. Sue and Stephanie stepped up last year and covered 1 year vacancies for Diane, who resigned, and Amber, who's resigned. And so they filled their 1 year, but they decided not to go for the 3-year term. So regretfully, we were so busy putting on events, regretfully we have those 2 vacancies. We reached out to several people, and at this point we still haven't filled those 2 vacancies. I'd be happy to entertain nominations or volunteers. If anyone from the floor said, please let me come to your directors' meetings on a monthly basis. They are kind of fun, and we appreciate your input as to what we do. I don't see anyone breaking their arm, raising their hand, but please talk to me afterwards if you'd rather not do that in a public forum and you'd be interested. It's 3-year term, we have monthly meetings, and then essentially we put on all the events. So it is work. Years ago, we used to have a flower committee and a housekeeping committee and a gardening committee, and well, those days are gone, and the directors pretty much put everything on. So, given that the 2 vacancies are still there, I'm asking for a nomination for the offices as they stand, and for Charlie Hazen to renew his directorship for a 3-year term. So, do I have a motion?
I make a motion.
And
I
that's
second the
Kathy.
motion.
And that was Ed. I'm town clerk in my other world, so I'm good at this. All in favor? Anyone opposed? This is good. We can continue on. So, all that. You haven't, Sam has the financial report that he's supposed to distribute.
Just had one comment.
Yeah.
I don't know how often you have the young kids over, but all the stuff that's here, the kids are absolutely fascinated trying to guess what was done back in the 1800s.
Yep. We still, well, most of the things we show them are up at the library right now.
Yeah.
There's a mousetrap.
Yeah.
You know what a mousetrap does? We're all adults, you know what a mousetrap does. Bob Mary tells them that they catch the mice and release them in the field. Because we don't want to mention what that mousetrap is really meant to do. But it is. We have some neat things. Want to talk about your financial report, Sam?
No, it's
Self-explanatory.
one thing I will say is that there was a good year in the stock market, as everybody's heard, and our investments are
Very good. May that continue. May that continue.
yes.
So if we've done all our business, I'd like to take this opportunity to come what you all came. I don't think you really came for birthday cake. You came to hear the Margaret Scott speaker. This gentleman's name is Keith Turquette, and we had a wonderful conversation over dinner, but I didn't get your bio, I have to admit. You're from Salem.
Yes.
I knew it that much, and
Living in Salem now for the past 4 or 5 years. Grew up just north of Boston in Malden. So I've always been in the area and became a student of the Salem Witch Trials through my time in Salem.
did I read that you participated in like Cry Innocent? And
Yep, Cry Innocent, The People versus Bridget Bishop. I was a cast member with them through History Alive for 3 years. So I've known that story in and out, and that really kind of sparked my continued interest.
And just as an aside, I want to point out that we also have in the audience Lucy Marks. Does everyone remember 1992, you said? She wrote a play. Was it about Margaret Scott?
Yes.
It was about the witches. Why else would it be a rally if it wasn't about Margaret Scott? And we had it, the Historical Society sponsored it, we had it at the church. I bet many of you attended that. And she came to our birthday party, probably because she wants to hear the speaker. But I do the newsletter, I see all these names, I'm like, ooh, I know your name. So it's so nice to see faces of people that are not always here. So that being said, I will give the stage to you and remind you have to speak up. Okay?
Of course.
Okay.
All
I'm
right.
going to come back and sit next.
How's everybody doing tonight?
Very well.
How many of you have heard anything about Margaret Scott before? Raise your hands. That's about what I expected. There's lots of information out there that we know about Margaret Scott. There's lots of information out there that we just don't. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit of both. So there is going to be some talk of speculation, conclusions I have come to based on what I've seen, but are inconclusive, and then of course all the information that we do know about her and the story that kind of brings forward. An interesting thing I found in looking through the Sheffield parish records in Sheffield, England, a Margaretta born to Edvardi Stevenson of Sheffield, Yorkshire, on the 1st of February, 1615/16. For anyone who doesn't know how records were held in that time, the new year didn't begin on January 1st. It began on March 25th. So, when you're looking at it from a modern perspective, the years are split. So that the January, February, and March of 1615 are part of what we think of as the year 1616. So she would have been born around that time. That puts her at about the right age for our Margaret Scott. We don't necessarily know that that is our Margaret Stevenson Scott. She may have come from that area. That is an area that has come to be known amongst historians as East Anglia, which has a lot of roots for a lot of those people who were settling in this area amongst the Puritan class. Many of the others who were accused of witchcraft in 1692 have their origin in that area as well. Rebecca Nurse came from Yorkshire County. Bridget Bishop came from Norwich in that same area. And so I thought, okay, this is a possibility. Maybe this is our Margaret, as her origin is as yet fairly obscure. Then recently discovered, interestingly, that a Andrew Stevenson came to New England from Newcastle upon Tyne just after 1637. He was made freeman at Cambridge in 1643, which is interesting to me because the only known record we have of Margaret is a marriage record in Cambridge in 1642. Now, what relation these two have is debatable. They would have been around the same age. Could have been siblings, cousins. Could have been no relation whatsoever. But I think it's rather too convenient that they both wound up at Cambridge with that having that same last name. It's also possible that she had Scottish origins. Her surname, as well as the surname of her husband, Benjamin, are both having Scottish origins going back to early times, to around the time of William the Conqueror. In fact, Stevenson's surname goes back to migrating originally from Northumberland in England to Scotland by about 1150. However, there's very scant records of Scottish immigrants coming to North America before 1650, at least in large quantity. About 1650, Oliver Cromwell sends a bunch of Scottish prisoners of wars to this area, to Saugus, actually, as part of the Saugus Ironworks. But of course, that postdates Margaret's time. So just where and why Margaret comes is still a bit of a mystery. We do know she was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1642, when, interestingly, she was judged at liberty to be married to Benjamin Scott. Now, I've seen a lot of different marriage records from this time period. That's not a usual marriage record. That was actually coming from the records of the Court of Assistants at the time. So she went to court and was declared at liberty to be married. The question is, why? My guess, my educated guess, would be either that she had to dissolve an indenture, that she had been serving a family in order to win her freedom and eventually marry, but that this opportunity of marriage came before the end of that indenture. Or it's possible that there was a prior marriage that has simply been lost to history. Based on the birth year that seems to be correct, she would have been about 26 years old. So it's not out of the ordinary that perhaps a previous marriage, perhaps with a sea captain, or someone who had died or been lost, but she was still waiting for him to come home. Either way, by 1642, she was judged at liberty to be married to Benjamin Scott, which gives us our Margaret Stevenson Scott. I do think that while there's a bit of a puzzle left behind, that time frame makes either the Sheffield or Newcastle connections very plausible, if only my speculation. Then, of course, we get to Benjamin Scott himself, who is just as mysterious, if not more so. He may have been born in Rowley, Yorkshire, England, around 1612, but there's no evidence that really substantiates that fully as of yet. There was a John Scott who came aboard the John and Sarah of London, arriving with Scottish POWs by 1652, but no relation has been uncovered as of this point. As I mentioned, the wording of the marriage record has led to that speculation of an indenture, that she was serving a family, and then Benjamin comes along, and they come together, and they are wed. And they remain in Cambridge for a few years before they come up here to Rowley. From 1644 to 1650, Margaret bore 3 sons, Joseph, Benjamin, and John, and a daughter, Elizabeth. Only Elizabeth was buried in Cambridge at about 6 days old. Bit of a tragedy for the Scots early on. 3 sons would wind up moving with her and Benjamin up to Rowley. Now, up to this point, the Scotts don't appear to own any land. So at Cambridge, they were likely boarders or renting. That would continue here in Rowley for a long time. But they would continue to live, and they would continue to have children. Their daughter Mary was their first child baptized in Rowley in 1651. So that is when we know they start living here in Rowley. It's a good 40 years before what happens does happen. They do have an infant son, Samuel, who dies after about 3 days, and that's in the year 1655. And that same year, Benjamin is fined for theft. I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition. That perhaps the price of burying his 3-year-old son led him to steal something. Again, speculation on my part to add a little bit of a human story to that little bit of factual information. Daughter Sarah was about 4 years old when she was buried in the summer of 1660. So again, this family suffered a lot of tragedy. However, in December of 1662, an interesting record I found, land in Haverhill was sold to Benjamin Scott of Rowley, tailor. First information I had heard of any kind of a trade towards Benjamin Scott. And it's the last time I saw a reference to him being a tailor. So, this was perhaps a different Benjamin Scott of Rowley, although I doubt that. It's possible. There are several Benjamin Scotts in a few records. There's one of Braintree, while this one's living in Cambridge, for example. But it seems to be connected with this particular Benjamin Scott, based on the records that I read. Then, in 1664, Benjamin Scott is granted land here in Rowley, around what is described as the clay pits or the brick kiln. So it would have been an area where the masons of the area were providing foundations for various homes, chimneys and the like. Then, that next year, Benjamin Scott swore the freeman's oath. Now, a lot of citizens would have been coming to Rowley, swearing the freeman's oath immediately, being given land, church membership, and the like. It seems that Benjamin Scott, and thus Margaret, were of a much lower class, that they did not have access to those privileges, at least not at first. But that year, the general court had permitted a change in the law of the freeman's oath, that you didn't just have to have enough land to be a free person. So that jurisdiction ended. Benjamin Scott and other persons of a lower class were able to swear oath to the king. And of course, a little bit more tragedy. Benjamin's will, dated June 6, 1671, would be proved that same year, that fall. And the state inventory is taken on July 14th, revealing what I suppose would be the livelihood of a tenant farmer, someone who did not own their own home, who was working land that they owned, perhaps also land that they didn't. There was no dwelling house listed on his inventory or in his will. There was no tailor's cloth or tools indicating that prior trade, nor was there mention of that Haverhill land. My take from that is that almost immediately he sold that land in order to support his family, and that he had to abandon his trade because it was not successful. And so he turned to farming to make his family have a life for themselves. He does, in his will, request that his 2 sons build a house for their mother on that land that he has in Rowley. I believe that very same land is where there is a Benjamin Scott house standing today, built about 1676. And so that would have been a few years after the will. So it seems that the sons did follow through with that. There were also bequests only of cattle and tools. So it's very clear to me that if Benjamin Scott had been a tailor, he had abandoned that trade, turned to that of a farmer in order to support his. Now in December of 1676, Benjamin Jr., who had been born in Cambridge, married neighbor girl Susanna Scales. It's about the same time as the house would have been built. And at the time, it was very, very common for families to share, for generations, to share homes. Oftentimes you will see homes like many of the first period homes that you might know, like the Platts Bradstreet house. It has 2 rooms on one side of a chimney and there's multiple floors. So each side of that house would be split, with the new generation taking one side to raise their family, and then the widowed mother oftentimes taking up the other side. I believe that's exactly what happened, with the couple occupying one end and Margaret occupying the other. A few years later, in 1680, her daughter Mary, the first to be baptized in Raleigh, wed a man named John Decker. By 1692, between 3 possible adult children, she had at least 8 living grandchildren. This is actually quite remarkable. Witchcraft accusations are oftentimes levied at women who are widowed, women who have not been able to bear children, and are seen thus as women who are resentful towards families that have had that success. Also, oftentimes of lower class. Margaret does fulfill some of these usual suspect gratifications. She ends up living 20 years as a widow. Very unusual for the time. You'll see a multitude of people from this time period, even examples of those who were accused, having multiple marriages. Bridget Bishop is just an example of that, having been married 3 times by 1692. Then, of course, you have John Proctor, Giles Corey, both of them having had 3 wives by the time they were accused. But Margaret never remarried, which may have something to do with her social station as well. When she died, Benjamin left her a very scant estate. There was not much in the way of money. There was not much in the way of property, but they made do. But, no doubt, as she was a widow for that long and in dire financial straits, she was a burden upon her family and a burden upon her community. And evidence presented by resentful neighbors suggests she turned to begging and charity, and in their opinion, could turn vicious if she was rejected. And now I ask a question. Is the only resident of Raleigh executed in Salem? Why Raleigh? How did the Salem hysteria reach Raleigh, Massachusetts? Many of you know the founding of Raleigh is completely separate from Salem. Many of the communities affected by the witch hysteria were originally part of Salem's boundaries in 1626. Raleigh was founded separate, as a separate plantation in 1639. Reverend Rogers and his company, coming from Raleigh, England. One of his company, was a William Jackson. 2 of his children would wind up being accused. One was not living in Raleigh at the time. Her name was Elizabeth Howe. She would be executed along with Sarah Wilde, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, and Susanna Martin. But her brother and nephew, John Jackson Sr. and Jr., were also accused, imprisoned. They were never executed. But, so it began.
Where were they executed? Excuse me, in Salem or here?
Yes, so the location of the executions, as well as the trials, was in Salem proper. The Salem trials took place in the Salem courthouse, at the time located in the middle of Washington Street in Salem. And then they were driven down by cart to an area known as, to many as Gallows Hill. It's been identified recently as Proctor's Ledge, right off of Boston Street, where, yes, there is currently a Walgreens in front as a bit of a storefront. More recently, a memorial has been placed near the city's own property in that area, with the names of those who were executed on the hill there, and on the opposite side of the Walgreens, entrance up, so you can walk up to the hill and look out onto the hill in that sense. Yes. So yes, the executions themselves took place. Now, interestingly enough, the Howe family marries into the family of John Bridges, who is affected by the Andover portion of the witch trials. For those who don't know, Andover becomes a haven of confessors. When Martha Carrier is accused, she is one of those who is fiercely defending her rights and her innocence, and is executed as a result. Much of her community, in fear, will confess to witchcraft. The Bridges family was extensive, so extensive that one of them was living in Rowley at the time. John Bridges had married a woman by the name of Mary Tyler Post, a widow, and they both came with additional children from prior marriages. Mary's first husband, by which she had a daughter, Mary, that was just what you did. You named the first daughter after the mother and the first son after the father. She was about 28 years old, single woman, I believe, at the time, in Rowley. She was jailed on the 2nd of August, 1692. Her mother, Mary Bridges, had been jailed a few days earlier on July 28th. Both accused as part of the Andover crisis, with some of the children from Andover who had been afflicted and accused Martha Carrier and other Andover residents, also accusing them. However, Mary Post, we don't have some of the surviving documentation from a lot of these cases. You would have, for example, an arrest warrant, and you would have a formal complaint saying that this person is doing witchcraft upon my child, they should be arrested. Then, once they've been arrested, an examination, they'll be questioned about the accusation and cross-examined with many witnesses. None of those survived for Mary Post except for her arrest warrant. The next time that I see Mary Post in the record is on August 13th, when she is being questioned as part of another person's accusation. Daniel Eames of Boxford had been arrested and accused. And Mary Post then says that he was not one of the witches that was part of her company. She had confessed. However, she lists a bunch of people that were of her company. And one of the first people that she mentions is Margaret Scott. Now, if she mentioned Margaret Scott on August 13th, might she have mentioned Margaret Scott on August 2nd or August 3rd? August 4th is the first moment that we have Margaret Scott's case begin, with the deposition of a Mary Daniels. She was a maidservant living in the home of Reverend Edward Payson at the time, and she is the first, I believe, to actually level an accusation based on the surviving documentation. And she does accuse her, Margaret, as well as a still undetermined Goodwife Jackson. She's non-existent, seemingly at the time, from the record itself. John Jackson's wife had passed away, and he had not remarried, and there was no identifiable Goodwife Jackson in the area. But that's what she had said in her particular accusation. Then, later on, through an indictment, it becomes clear that on August 5th, another Rowley girl accusation against Margaret Scott, Frances Wycombe, who was about 17 years old. She was the daughter of a military captain, Daniel Wycombe, who had also recently taken a second wife. So it seems like home life for Frances was difficult. And perhaps she was afraid of what the future held. Perhaps that was similar with Mary Daniels, as someone who was serving in someone else's home. What did her future hold? Now, there are a lot of missing documents from Margaret's case. A frustrating thing for a historian, no doubt. No formal complaint. However, I extrapolate that maybe one was filed by Reverend Payson on behalf of Mary, or perhaps by Captain Wycombe on behalf of Frances. No arrest warrant exists, though there is for Mary Post, one executed by Constable Joseph Dewitt, who may have been the only constable of Rowley at the time. So it stands in mind to me that it's possible that he was also the one to arrest Margaret. And again, no pre-trial examination notes, unfortunately. That would certainly shed some light on a lot of things that we kind of get to guess at. Margaret herself likely denied all charges. Perhaps she felt for the girls as they showed their symptoms in the middle of the court. But it's all speculation. going back to the Bridges family for a moment, by August 25th, a Susanna Post, who was Mary's half-sister, would name John Jackson Jr. and Sr., Goodwife Scott, and John Howard of Raleigh all as being witches. And so it seemed that much of Raleigh had begun to get caught up in this hysteria as well. But Margaret would be the only one who would face the court to her death. There were a few neighbors who did bring forward what we call malefic evidence. Now, much of the evidence against those accused in 1692 was spectral in nature, the invisible appearance of their person harming individuals, usually young girls, sometimes married women as well, who were also afflicted and tormented by the appearances of these witches. Malefic is different, is when something happens after they have said something to you. It's kind of they said this and then this happened, and I find that suspicious. So we have the Nelson family, which is another family that came over with Reverend Rogers, 2 generations down, obviously. Philip and Sarah Nelson would swear that their neighbor, Robert Shillatu, who had been dead since 1687 at this point, claimed that Margaret Scott was a witch for 2 to 3 years before he died, and that he would never be well so long as she lived. And Captain Lycombe came forward with his own story, swearing that 5 to 6 years ago, which happens to also fall at about 1687, she came to pick corn from his field. This was a common occurrence for those who were of the lower class. They would go to the farms of those who were more successful, and they would pick kind of the last of the corn that they weren't going to sell. It was kind of a general community agreement. But he asked her to wait until he had picked it himself and it was out of the field. It seems that she didn't like this, at least from his perspective. She apparently told him he would not get it out of the field that night, and in fact he couldn't until the next day. And he found that suspicious. And then, Philip's brother, Thomas Nelson, would swear, again, 6 years ago, 1687. Something bad happened that year between Margaret and the people of Raleigh, clearly, when she'd asked him to bring her some wood. Now, it happened that she was owed by him about 10 shillings in value of money. So he offered her to bring her 10 shillings in value of wood in payment of that debt. But she needed the wood, but she also needed the money. So she was very angry that he was trying to cheat her in that sense. And when he denied her, he suddenly found that his cattle had died strangely. And he would go on to say that he believed that she was a witch. It just happened that Mr. Nelson was on the grand jury that indicted her. And, as I mentioned, was Philip Nelson's brother. In a sense, Salem witch trials helped to influence changes in our own court system. No impartiality in that particular case. Now, because there's so much information missing from Margaret's case, no one knows if anyone ever did defend Margaret. Surviving evidence points to no, that perhaps her 3 adult children were too afraid. They had their own families to worry about. Perhaps she was that much of a burden to them that they didn't want to deal with it. Or maybe they did. Maybe they signed petitions that don't exist anymore. Maybe she wrote her own petition that doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that they believed her guilt necessarily, but there were very prominent families that were accusing her. And by the point that she was being accused, 6 women had already been executed. And that was going to be trying her. One Raleigh minister, Mr. Samuel Phillips, defended Elizabeth Howe, as I mentioned earlier. And one Elizabeth was originally from Raleigh. Might he have done the same for Margaret? And there's just no record of it. And of course there was Baron Payson, who supported his maid's accusation against her, Mary Daniels. What's most telling of all, to me, There's been scores of condemned families petitioned for redress, whether of reputation or for financial damages. Margaret was one of 6 cases untouched by relations. And there were relations alive. Her son Benjamin and his wife were alive, as were their children. Several children from several other grandchildren would have been alive at this point as well. So whether they just felt it was not important, that 20 years or so had passed, these cases begin about 1710, that it was time to let the past lie. But no one will truly know. So, as I mentioned, by August 5th, when Margaret was arrested, the court of Oyer and Terminer, which had been arranged by Governor Phipps, had already tried and executed 6 women. Not to mention, 3 people had already died in prison. These were the choices before her. And she would remain in jail until about the 15th of September. Between then and the 17th, she was condemned by that very same court on 2 counts of spectral evidence. Only the 2 girls accusing her brought indictments upon her. She was then hanged on September the 22nd, just under 2 months following her arrest, with 7 other innocent persons who were likely strangers to her, or had been, as all of the other 7 were from different communities. 2 were from Andover, so she may have heard of them. The rest, absolute strangers. That is how she died. Now, I consider Margaret what I call one of the forgotten, one of the 6 whose families don't come forward. But the Massachusetts General Court, which was the Massachusetts legislature, and still is, begins organizing a way to give back to the families that were damaged by this particular case. In May of 1709, they were petitioned to restore their reputations and remunerate the estates of the sufferers. And within a year, they begin to do so. They order a committee to determine the names of sufferers and the families and what damages their estates sustained. And from that point forward, about 48 claimants come forward for victims. These are people that were convicted and not executed, convicted and executed, or people that simply had languished in prison and suffered having to pay their room and board for being in prison. By October of 1711, in a year, the General Court authorized payment of damages to all estates with claims made upon them, and all attainders, that is, convictions, reversed. However, in November, committee member and a General Court representative from Rowley since 1689, Nehemiah Jewett, brother perhaps of Constable Joseph Jewett, writes to Justice Samuel Sewell with names of 6 sufferers with no persons or relations making claims. So while all those families that came forward led to the reversal of their convictions, 6 women remained with convictions on their names. They would remain fully till at least 1957. That year, the Massachusetts General Court was petitioned by a family of Ann Pudditer, who was one of the executed at Salem, and in response passed the resolves of 1957, Chapter 145, exonerating Ann Pudditer and certain other persons. A legal loophole that left 5 people on the books as convicted witches after that. Now in 1992, 2 memorials to the 20 executed were unveiled at Salem's Charter Street Cemetery and in Danvers, near the original Salem Village Meeting House. That same year, in September, The Devil Will Be Familiar, by descendant Lucy Merckx, play about Margaret Scott's life, was performed at the First Congregational Church of Raleigh. Following that procession, went to the Green, laid a memorial stone to Margaret's name. That particular day, Governor Weld did issue a proclamation clearing her name. However, the 1957 resolution still existed on the books. And on Halloween 2001, the Massachusetts General Court amended that resolution. Under the Acts 2001, Chapter 145, replacing certain other persons with their actual names. Richard Bishop, Alice Parker, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Reed, all from different communities, all affected by superstition. On March 16th, 2012, the original indictment on Mary Daniels surfaced and was put up for auction in New York. Sold for $26,000. Then on July 19th, 2017, a memorial was finally placed at the location of the hangings, known today as Proctor's Ledge, as the land itself was owned by the Proctor family following the executions. Eventually came into the possession of the city of Salem. They held that plot for a long, long time and had a lot of opposition from Salem citizens to put anything on that public land because of the private homes around it. But finally, there is a location naming all 19 who were hanged at Gallows Hill. And there is as I mentioned earlier, on the opposite side, there is a path up to the hill so that you can visit the place and reflect on what had happened on that location 4 different times in 1692. The saddest reflection is that Margaret's execution, she was one of 8, was the last execution to take place. And she had only been in jail for 2 months. She was also the oldest, about 77 years old at the time she was executed. And that's Margaret's story.
Question, with all of this happening in our early history here in this country, was there anything of this equivalent happening throughout Europe or the...
Yes, so the Salem witch trials has their kind of history to owe to trials in England that had happened prior, as well as a handful of prior witch trials that had happened in Massachusetts throughout from about 1640 to the 1680s. Anne Glover was hanged in Boston in 1688, a case that is seen to have heavily influenced the judges during the Salem witch trials as well. She was Irish. She couldn't speak good lick of English. She was very easily accused. She was an easy, usual suspect, seen to have been attacking children through specters, had no way to defend herself, and was hanged for it. But yes, the English cases that are similar are done in a similar way. You have facing, there's a slew of different documents that were being used from about 1600 onward in English courts. I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but there's a famous witch hunter general who was part of the witch trials in England as well. So it was a big push and a big part of the Puritan lineage of New England as well. Any other questions?
So you said that Margaret was the last to be executed. You mean the last to be executed on Gallows Hill?
Well, that's actually a good question. So she was in the last execution on Gallows Hill, as it was never used again for executions. In fact, it had only ever been used for this particular case. most capital crimes were punished in the capital, which was Boston at the time. Many of these hangings would take place on Boston Common or out in the Outer Harbor Islands. That famously would happen for pirates in the turn of the century, 1700s as well. But because so many of these cases had sprung up in Essex County, the governor felt that Essex County should deal with it. So Salem, being the county seat, was the one that was responsible for it. So they found some common land just outside the city limits, more or less, which became known as Gallows Hill. What's interesting, though, is we don't know of the 8 what any order was, whether it was done in any sort of order at all. But it's possible that she was the last one hanged.
I'm not sure who can answer this. There's a MargaretScott Commons right across the way. When did that all take place, or when was that set
I
aside?
believe that was dedicated in 1992,
Right.
but I'm not sure.
That was that same time,
Yeah.
1992. It was the tricentennial.
Yes. Yes. In 1992 was the 300th anniversary of the witch trials taking place, which is why you saw that year see so much going on, where you have the 2 memorials set aside for all of the victims at both Salem and Danvers, and a lot of the individual communities honoring their accused as well. Yes.
So you have these people who've been accused of witchcraft and then executed. Where were they buried?
Well, we have a record of them being buried in shallow common graves on Gallows Hill. There is family tradition in a lot of the cases of families coming to retrieve their bodies. We know that is tradition for Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, George Jacobs. Whether that happened with Margaret's family, we don't know.
I'm sure.
Yeah, many of them were buried in common graves right there, and not buried well. Some, after the August 19th hanging, a foot in someone's chin was still visible from the grave. These, people burying them saw these people as the devil's minions. They were not given a proper, sacred burial.
You were around for very long.
Yes.
There was a little story about putting the monument in 1992, because we never were able to find out where she was buried. And there had been accounts that it's somewhere in this neighborhood. And when they were digging the hole to put the stone in, they found some bones.
Really?
And they did have it checked out, and they were pony bones.
Ah.
It would have made a great story.
Oh, yeah.
Horrible story. That scared everybody.
Any more questions?
Excellent talk.
Maybe of Lucy Marks, did you all learn something that you didn't know about Scott and the witch trials in general? I wanted to say over supper, you and I had a conversation about the Samuel Phillips diary that the church recently unearthed, and I heard Samuel Phillips' name come up there.
Yes.
I had said to you that it's been transcribed, and I believe it's online
Is it?
at the Congregational Library website. I was standing in the back, and yeah, did they tell me it was? But I believe if you start at the Congregational Library, which is in Boston, as a website, I think you'll find the Samuel Phillips diary. And when we found it, you all remember when we found the Samuel Phillips diary, which was 20 years ago, maybe now. It was a long lost diary. We knew the church owned it originally, and then some good-hearted clerk of the church guarded it so well that she hid it so well that it was lost for like 40 years. And not until the First National Bank in Ipswich closed did they find it in their safe. And that was all lovingly wrapped, and luckily the manager was my next door neighbor, and he called me and he said, you might be interested in coming over and looking at this. I think probably because of town clerk he thought it'd be interesting. But the clerk of the church, the current clerk of the church, almost cried when he found it, because he had always felt as though it was lost on his watch. it really wasn't lost in his watch, but it was just discovered to be lost on his watch. But that being said, we always said we didn't know what it said in it because it was a 300-year-old document. You couldn't open it and say, oh, look what it says.
Right.
Because of the fragility of the pages. And I said many times, for all we know, the answer to the witch trial conundrum could be answered there. I don't really think that's true because we would have heard it by now. But
Right.
you might find some interesting information relative
To Margaret's case. Yeah.
possible because that's kind of newly surfaced
Really
information.
covered, yeah.
Everyone enjoy that?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Very
Thank you
good.
very
Did
much.
someone ask where you went to school?
Salem State. Salem State University. Was college when I started there, and they transitioned into university status while I was there. Studied theater there rather than history, but I've been a accidental student of American history since I could walk and talk. So I've always found my way back to it in some way, shape, or form.
Very good. Appreciate it. Did you do any other?
I work currently at the Boston Tea Party Museum. I interpret George Hughes, who was a shoemaker.
Come back and do a shoemaking.
Right? I'm learning, actually. I'm studying a bit about the actual shoemaking. Tell his story. He's the last known surviving participant of the Tea Party when he is discovered in the 1830s, 60 years after it happens. And he is maybe one of 10 people still alive from that
In
era.
1830.
In 1830, from that time. And so there are 2 biographies written about his life. So he has an enormous amount about his life for someone who accomplished his entire life. It's a
Now, when-
rare opportunity.
When would Raleigh have been in the shoe industry? About would we say 1830? I know it was during the Civil War, so it would be pertinent to us too, as the details of shoemaking. In 1989, we had Ralph Foster, Count, who was a shoemaker, was in the Foster family, and he was, 95 at that point. But Ralph is no longer with us, so he can't share any more information with us. But we have all kinds of shoemaking equipment and some ideas about how it was all put together. But that's always on our list of things to do, is maybe we should investigate it. So we're always looking for new speaking ideas, new event ideas. If you have an idea, call us. I can't say that we're going to do 1 and 2 events a month next year because I just don't think we can. But maybe we can do one a month. We certainly did more than we've done in the past, and it's been very well received. When we started, I'd like to thank Kathy Cousins and Joan Lyons and Janet Peabody and myself sat on the programming committee, and we threw out all kinds of programs. You can't imagine the programs we didn't use. We've had all kinds of ideas, including tonight was supposed to be an extravagant dinner dance at the Bradstreet Farm, but it was like a bridge too far. We just couldn't get it all put together. This was a lovely thing. But we had all kinds of ideas, and we hope to be able to continue on in some way next year. But one of our first discussions was, are we looking to make money at this? Is this a money-making opportunity? Or are we just looking to generate goodwill for the Historical Society and get our name recognized? And that's the road we chose to go down. And so we're hoping with all of these events that we've had over the year, people are starting to think favorably on the Historical Society that was kind of invisible for a while because we just didn't have the wherewithal to put events on. So tell your family and friends and come back to other events. And we appreciate all of you. We have people from Georgia, people from Boston. I think that's a term. It's coming from Boston. And then all of you Raleigh people. We thank you all for coming. We want you to drive carefully. But first, I want you to stop in the kitchen and take a piece of cake. So you're not taking that cake home. There's a bunch of pieces of the cake, and just help yourself. And you have a little late night snack or dessert for tomorrow. Please.